very warm welcome to all who have joined us this afternoon to attend our seminar, School Privatisation, Canadian and Swedish Trajectories. The privatization of education has been a topic of interest to educational researchers for 3 decades and more. The aim of the seminar is to trace its development into new conjunctures, especially those established in states with strong democratic and welfare traditions, where national education systems have been reshaped to meet global reform challenges. Well, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Sue Winton, Professor and York Research Chair in Policy Analysis for Democracy at the Faculty of Education in York University in Toronto, Canada. Linda Rönnberg and Nafsika Alexadiou, both professors in educational work at the Department of Applied Educational Science at Umeå University in Sweden. All 3 speakers have researched and published extensively about the privatization of education and the inequalities associated with it. In the first presentation, Sue Winton will focus on the education privatization in Canada, a country often recognized as having highly equitable public education systems. Citing research from her recent book, Unequal Benefits, Privatization and Public Education in Canada, Sue will discuss the implications of the transformations of the Canadian education systems for social inequalities, especially during and post-COVID. Next, we're turning to Sweden. Linda Rönnberg and Nafsika Alexadiou will draw on their ongoing research project, Going Global, Swedish social companies and their international operations, to talk about the emergence of a national education free school industry, with companies now expanding abroad to operate schools based on their Swedish experiences. They will discuss the implications of this model for teacher work and agency.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Anna, and welcome to everybody who is joining us this afternoon or this morning, maybe this evening, depending on where you are. Really glad that you're here. I'm just going to start my timer so I don't go over time. So welcome. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. As Anna said, I'm a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada. And if we were on York's campus, this is what you might see, this background here behind me. I'm really grateful to have been a visiting scholar at Goldsmiths this past fall, hosted by Anna as well. And again, thank you so much for organizing this panel. So briefly, this presentation today is based on my book. You can see the cover here. It's published by the University of Toronto Press, but I've tried to bring in some updates. This book was published in 2022, which means it went into press around 2021. So, big changes since then with the pandemic, and new data is emerging from what's happened since with some of the topics that I've talked about. So what I'm going to do this in the next little bit is I'm going to talk about the way I understand privatization, what it means when I say that word. I'm going to provide some examples of different ways that public education is being privatized across Canada. I certainly will not be able to talk about everything, but I'll throw out some examples. And if there's things that interest you in particular, feel free to ask about them in the chat. And then I'm going to talk about just some different efforts to resist privatization of public education in Canada. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the country of Canada itself. It is a really big country geographically. It's the 2nd largest in the world. Nevertheless, it's often dominated by and assumed often to be the same as the United States, our neighbor to the south. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that, can rub Canadians the wrong way, where we have a lot of similarities, but we certainly have a lot of differences from the US. That was one of the things I wanted to do with the book, was just to sort of bring the Canadian research to international conversations about education privatization. So within Canada, each province and territory is responsible for providing and governing education, public education, to its the residents that qualify, generally people who are under 18. So we don't have a national system of education. The ministers of education of each province may work together on some things, and there is some funding for specific initiatives that comes from the federal government. But by and large, we're just talking, it's province or territory driven. Also, it's really, I have to say, for such a big country, we have, a relatively small population. And furthermore, we have very limited research on education privatization across the country. A lot of that research has been conducted by people outside of universities, so journalists and teacher unions, as well as advocacy organizations and public policy think tanks. So I'm going to be referring to some of their work as well as my own and my academic colleagues in the presentation, just like I do in the book. And I should say also there's a lot of diversity in terms of the policies and practices across the country in terms of privatization. So, what's happening in one province may not be happening in another. But nevertheless, there is a big general similarity, which is that we can find evidence of policies supporting and facilitating education privatization right across the country. So just now turning to what I mean when I say privatization. I draw on the work of Ball and Udall and Lubienski to talk about three different kinds of education privatization. And for some people, this may be review, but I just want to make sure that everyone who's on the call today knows sort of what I'm talking about. So one of the ways that education is privatized is through a kind of a group of practices that Ball and Udall refer to as the privatization of public education. And this is where we see, private actors being brought into the public education to take on roles and responsibilities that had once been those that belonged to the government, the state itself. These roles may include funding education, building schools, providing education, governing education, and creating policy, among other possibilities. It also is the situation where businesses are able to profit from their involvement in public education as well. So that would sort of fall under the idea of privatization of public education. Second sort of group of practices is that those that can be characterized as privatization within public education. And there's sort of two main strategies there. One of those is to use techniques and practices common in the private sector to govern what goes on in public education. And though that collection of practices is generally referred to as new public management. And then another manifestation where we see privatization in public education is through the creation of markets in education. And so in a market model of education, just like in any market, it involves customers choosing between different products based on various kinds of information, as well as their own preferences and desires and needs and resources. So in the marketplace, sellers will compete by creating, unique and highly desired products of different quality and marketing them to consumers. And so then within education markets, the products, of course, are specialized schools or alternative programs. The consumers are parents, families, and their children. And some of the information that they might look to inform their choices could include graduation rates, standardized test scores, school rankings, and so forth. And then the third kind of privatization, that's sort of an outcome of the other two that I want to highlight, is when we see people beginning to see public education as primarily about a place where you can accrue your own private individual benefits or those of your children, rather than places that are pursuing what is for the greater good of society primarily. I mean, both are always going on, but it has to do with an emphasis of private over the public interests happening. And so this shifting view of public education impacts what people expect from schools and what they're willing to allow for other people. So just, the short, I guess, well, anyway, the highlight is this. The research in Canada, just like elsewhere, shows that the privatization of public education, while, it does certainly offer a lot of advantages to certain groups and people and families, on the whole, it also produces and reproduces patterns of social inequality, and it undermines democratic ideals of public education, including that education should be accessible, free, equitable, and publicly governed. And it's really important to acknowledge that few, in fact, probably zero, public schools in Canada have ever really met these commitments. I mean, since Canada's very founding, its public schools have benefited some groups much more than others. In particular, they've provided far more advantages to white, English and French speaking, able-bodied and middle and upper class children and parents and their families than they have to poor, disabled, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized families. So I just want to acknowledge that achieving the ideals of public education require a lot more than simply rejecting privatization, but doing so is also part of the efforts to achieve those democratic ideals. So what I'm going to do now is turn to some of the ways that privatization is taking place in Canada through the shifting of responsibilities. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to talk about policies that shift responsibility for funding public education to the private sector. So these policies include school fundraising. So that is fundraising done by families, local communities, and educators. And certainly this is not a new practice. It's been around for a long time, but the scale and the necessity have increased over time. And, this happens, school fundraising happens lots of ways. It's very popular for schools to sell things such as the magazines, as you can see advertised on this sign outside of where my sons used to go to school. They sell cookie dough, wreaths, pizza, cheese, books. I feel like you name it, it's sold. But that's one way of fundraising for schools. There's also events that could be held, fun fairs, movie nights, parent socials. And then often we see businesses connected to these events through donations or sponsorships or other kinds of partnerships. And the practice is very common. People for Education is an advocacy organization in Ontario, Canada, who has been tracking policy change for decades now. Now, before the pandemic, their research showed that 99% of elementary schools and just almost as many secondary schools or high schools were doing some forms of school fundraising. Now, in 2023, that number has decreased. Just 88% of elementary school principals reported that they were doing fundraising, and 70% of secondary schools were fundraising. So, that's an interesting change. It's attributed in part by those that responded to the economic situations facing families. So it remains to be seen whether, fundraising is really decreasing or if it will continue to rise and be strong, as the economy strengthens. Similarly, besides just turning to families and communities for money, sometimes schools will look to the private sector, for-profit sector, as well as philanthropies to top up their public funding. So one of the ways they do this is through applying for grants. Again, People for Education found in 2019 that 83% of high schools were receiving grants. And of those, a quarter were coming from businesses and another 30% from philanthropies. And at the elementary level, so that's kindergarten to grade 8, 75% of schools were receiving grants. And of those, 17% were coming from businesses and 18% for philanthropy. So about a third were coming from business and philanthropy. However, thinking of different ways that schools raise money, what we know is that there's a lot of variation in terms of what boards are able to raise. So what you're looking at, this graph here is actually looking at what school boards in and around the Toronto, Ontario, the Greater Toronto area were able to fundraise. This is an elementary school in 2016, so it's a bit out of date, but I anticipate that the patterns would be the same. What you can see here, just a few highlights. So the very first, the first line, York Catholic School District, is literally across the street from the Toronto Public, which is the bottom bar. So you can see here that York Catholic District School Board raised more than 3 times the amount per student than the board that's literally across the street. And similarly, I don't want to get into too much detail, but the Toronto Public School Board and the Toronto Catholic School Board they cover the very same geographical area. They're both in the Toronto area. And you can see that the Toronto Catholic District School Board fundraised twice as much as the Toronto Public. So school boards in the very same geographical area raising vastly different amounts. And then, of course, within the school boards, there's a lot of variation as well by neighborhood by neighborhood. Again, People for Education's research showed that schools, probably won't surprise anyone to know that those schools in high socioeconomic neighborhoods raised twice as much, if not more in some cases, than schools in low socioeconomic areas. So what's wrong with school fundraising? People will say, oh, it's a great way to involve families and so on. But, it does create unequal access to materials and opportunities for students, including technology, field trips, guest speakers, and so on. And this is, of course, all happening in publicly funded schools. And as I mentioned, it's usually the kids who already enjoy the most advantages outside of schools that are able to access these extra resources within schools. Now, a strategy that school districts are turning to more and more in Canada is to increase their funding or top up their government funding by turning to international students. Now, the number of international students at the K-12 level has increased a lot in Canada over the last few decades. In 2019, there were over 60,000 international students at the K-12 level studying Canada's public as well as private K-12 schools. Now, that number has decreased since the pandemic. However, the sort of most recent figures are saying we're back up to 82% of where we were beforehand. And so again, it remains to be seen if the trajectory is going to continue to rise as it had before. Students who come from outside of Canada are not eligible to receive free education. So of course, the way that the school districts raise money is that they charge tuition, and tuition can be, $15,000 or more. And so it is a lucrative source of funding for some boards. In one board in Ontario, their revenues from international student tuition increased more than 11 times, over a 5-year period from 2011 to 2016. So, this is something that districts are turning to more and more, where they're able. Because of course, what we find, just like different schools, school districts are not equally able to fundraise from international students and their families. So this is a really busy chart, but the highlights are this. This is a study of school districts in British Columbia, which is the westernmost province of Canada. And some researchers there, Wendy Poole and her colleagues at the University of British Columbia, did a study to look at school districts' ability to raise money or recruit international students. And what they found was great disparities between rural and urban districts in particular. So if you look at the rural districts, let me say it another way. Of all the districts they looked at, the 4 that were able to raise the least, that is 0, were all rural districts. And the ones that were able to raise the most were all urban districts. So again, what this means is that some districts within the public system, I just want to kind of keep saying that over and over again, are able to have way more money to spend on programs and resources from their students. And so then again, these policies and these ongoing efforts to attract international students are creating inequities between boards. Similarly, like other forms of fundraising, turning to tuition-paying students for funds to supplement government funding really undermines the idea that public schools should be fully funded by the government. And it also kind of lets governments off the hook to provide adequate funding. Okay, another sort of form of fundraising or shifting funding, and as well as combined with building, that sometimes happens, it seems to come and go across the provinces in Canada, is to turning to public-private partnerships as a way to fund, maintain, and build schools. So sometimes these are called P3s or PPPs. And so Manitoba is the latest province that's turning to PPPs or P3s as a strategy to fund and build schools. As I mentioned, other provinces have tried it: Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Alberta, all with, outcomes that didn't live up to the hype. Let's just put it that way. So what they've generally across these provinces where they've used this model, schools were generally built quickly, and they did enable governments to finance them over a long period. However, the public-private partnerships did not lead to cost savings, which was often sort of the promise of this model, as well as a lot of local community needs were not able to be met through the public-private partnership model. Now I'm just going to talk about one more sort of shift, and that's in governance, and in particular, Alberta's charter schools. So charter schools are like here in the UK, there are academies. In the US, they're also called charter schools. So, and Alberta is the only province in Canada that has charter schools or has ever had charter schools. And it's not new. They were introduced in, almost 30, actually, I guess it is 30 years ago now, in 1994. And at that time, though, there was a cap that was limited and a sort of a process that where if you wanted to open one of these schools, you first had to go to the school district. So these charter schools, they receive the same money as those in regular public schools. I mean, they're technically part of the public system, but what makes them stand out is that, in part, is that they're governed by a charter board. They're not governed by publicly elected trustees. They are able to charge some fees, and they may exclude students through different kinds of admission criteria. Now, again, I said initially there was a cap at 15. But in 2019, there was a bill that was passed, the one that removed the cap, so that created the conditions for more charter schools to exist. And furthermore, this Choice in Education Act, you can see that a tweet here from the Premier at the time, this act actually changed how charter schools were approved and actually made it easier for them to be approved. And so since these changes were introduced, the number of charter schools has almost tripled. So from 13 to 36. And there's now having organizations that are operating multiple charter schools. And if, research that's happened on charter schools in the USA and has demonstrated that they generally segregate children across race and class lines, sometimes leaving poor and racialized students in schools with fewer resources. So I'm going to just switch gears now and talk about policies that create education markets, another manifestation of privatization. Just a reminder, this is sort of like the idea of creating choices within the education marketplace. The way it happens currently in Canada is when students choose a particular school, be it private or public, a certain option within the public system, the money from the government follows the student. It goes directly to the school that the student chooses. It doesn't go like to the family and then the family uses it, but it goes to the schools. So we've already talked about charter schools. So that's one of these policies that falls under the school marketplace. But again, it's only exists in Alberta. But there are other models. Specialized schools and programs are very popular across many provinces, but again, particularly they exist in the urban school districts. And this is where these programs offer something that's sort of in addition to, or something special in its regular program. So it could be like a curriculum focus, like a science focus, or maybe a specific foreign language or culture. It could be an academic programs like the International Baccalaureate or Advanced Placement courses, or so on. And there's been a real increase in the number and variety of these programs over time. So some of the challenges or some of the places where they undermine democracy, the democratic commitments to public education is when they, many of them have application, like not everybody can attend. They have limited numbers. And so there may be auditions, you may have to sit for an exam, there may be interviews, plus all of the other knowledge that's required of deadlines, application, program expectations, transportation, and fees. As I mentioned, some of the schools exclude students. There's one in Montreal, for example, that, it limits the students, it won't take students with all kinds of exceptionalities, for example, like they'll only take some students with some exceptionalities. There's a requirement that students at this particular school have to be proficient in English or French. So anyone who doesn't speak those as a first language, they are excluded. They don't take anyone who has had a history of any failing any subjects. So again, through these exclusions violate public education's commitment to accessible and free education. We do have 5 provinces that provide public funding to private schools. Many of these were not initially introduced, as a reform strategy, but that is one of the rationales for these schools today. And furthermore, in some places, well, for example, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the amount of funding that goes to private school has increased over time. So for example, initially in Alberta in the late 70s, it was around 33% of what public schools received per student. And now that number is 70%. In Saskatchewan, just recently, they increased the number to some schools to 75% of what the public school received for the same thing. So you can just see a shift over time. I think I'm just going to end with my talking about school choices, but there's lots of other ones as well. But, e-learning is one that has definitely emerged and increased over time. There's different kinds. There's the kind of e-learning where a student might just take one course amongst many, only one's online, but the rest are all in person. We call that supplementary e-learning. And then there's the kind where their whole academic program might be online. And what we're seeing across provinces, in some provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, greater and greater centralization of e-learning courses. And some people have said they're concerned about what that's going to mean for rural areas. If they become centralized, then the school districts that serve the rural communities may not have the resources that they need to continue to offer the kind of education they wish to. And then in Ontario, not only are they centralizing, but hey, we're going out to the world. We'll sell you our online courses for a fee as well. And just to close, I just wanted to say a few things. There's certainly some pushback against privatization across Canada, and we have seen some changes and some responses. So for example, in Toronto, with a lot of pushback on the specialized programs, as I mentioned, with excluding certain students, just this past year, they've launched a new way to admit students. Now students, no more interviews, no more auditions. Now it's based on interest, and a certain number of spaces are allocated to historically disadvantaged and excluded groups. And then we have an example in 2016 in Quebec, a mother launched a class action lawsuit against school boards for charging fees to families inappropriately, and they won, and all the parents received checks in the mail. for those fees. And finally, I just wanted to put a shout out to the Public Education Exchange. When I was writing my book, I found it very hard to find research on public education, privatization across Canada. And I thought, gee, I'm a full-time academic. I have resources, I have time, and I can't access this work very easily. So I wish there was a network to link all of us who were advocating for and researching on privatization of public education in Canada, and there just wasn't. So I partnered with the Canadian Teachers Federation, the BC Teachers Federation, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, as well as University of Manitoba and the University of Windsor, and many other collaborators to create this network and to create what we now call the Public Education Exchange. And our attempt is to build the network of researchers and public education advocates to exchange knowledge about the trajectory and outcomes of education privatization. So I think I'll wrap up there. I hope you'll come and check out our website at some time. And I look forward to hearing your comments and questions after we hear what I'm sure will be a fabulous presentation by our next panelists. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much, Sue. Fantastic. Many things to think about and talk about, but we'll leave this for a bit later. Handing over to Nafsika and Linda.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for inviting us and organizing this event. And thank you very much, Sue, for opening up the Canadian case in such a detailed and informative way to us. Looking forward to our discussion as well later on. We will move from Canada to Sweden, but we will not stay there. We will also be embarking on a journey to Asia, to be more specific, also to go to India. But that is for later. We will start in Sweden. We will start by situating the Swedish case of education privatization. That is indeed a thrilling and interesting one in many ways. But we will begin even more locally than that. To mention some of our ongoing projects currently that we're working with at Umeå University. Me and Nafsika, who are here to present today, are co-leaders of a research group at our department at Umeå University called PEP. And in this group, we have a long-standing interest in education privatization issues and several previous projects, but also some interesting ongoing ones. And I would just like to briefly mention that one of them is focused on early childhood and care, a sector that is also quite privatized, even though in a slightly different way. However, far more under-researched than, for instance, compulsory education, with indeed both national and internationally interesting dimensions and ownerships. Another ongoing project is just recently started, where student health and the involvement of private actors and processes of commercialization is in the limelight when it comes to how student health services are provided in compulsory schools. But the project that will be in our primary interest to talk about with you today is the Going Global one that in the beginning. This is an ongoing project that was indeed affected by the pandemic, but we have done research on a number of data collection strategies. We have focused on 3 large Swedish education companies that have embarked on an international journey abroad. We have focused on interviews with company management, but also visited schools abroad that are owned by these large Swedish corporations. We are very grateful that we have been able to visit a total of 8 of these foreign operations in India that we will go to later, where Ann-Sofie Holm, one of our colleagues there on the slide that unfortunately couldn't be here today, went to India and visited Swedish-owned schools. But more on that later. We have also visited schools in Spain and Norway. And once again, we are very grateful that we have been granted this access and the possibility to gain insight on site, visiting how this Swedish ownership, if at all, is displayed in these movements across borders when these companies move abroad. We will still be focusing on the Swedish case to begin with. We are not ready to go abroad yet. We need to situate these companies and understand where they come from, literally. And that's what I will be trying to do for the next 15 minutes or so, and then Nafsika will take over and take us all to India. So looking at the Swedish case of education privatization, it is quite a useful starting point to acknowledge the social democratic welfare state heritage that is often, via just Esping Andersen and his categorization, attributed to Sweden and, for that matter, the other Nordic countries, characterized by significant investments in social welfare, a commitment to social justice and equality, etc., etc. However, even though these traits are still quite marked and visible in Sweden and in other Nordic countries today, there has been quite a shift in the trajectory where so-called liberal traits involving marketization, privatization, and commercialization, that I will get into more detail to it in just a minute, that this has indeed transformed the welfare state in a profound way, and not the least within the area of education. So going back, this is not a very recent development. This has been going on for quite some time. But we also need to acknowledge that this has not been the job of just one government, but of several, even though in the 1990s, a number of very important decisions on school choice, on introducing a school voucher, on free establishment of private actors were taken and implemented by a right-wing government. This has been sustained and reinforced throughout time and through different kind of political majorities and constellations. We need to situate our conversation into a conceptual frame of some kind. And in this area, I find it very helpful to go to Anna Hogan and Greg Thompson and their three concepts of marketization, privatization, and commercialization, and how they are interlinked. So marketization in this kind of conceptual mapping would imply the creation of a series of policy logics that aim to create quasi-markets. The quasi is really important also to acknowledge that this is not real markets that we're talking about, but the very feared ones. But also to acknowledge that this is kind of an umbrella concept. This involves anything from school choice to, for instance, measures and policies on accountability, etc. However, marketization also includes privatization and commercialization, in which they are perceived as logical solutions to the perceived challenges, positioning them as logical solutions. Privatization would refer to the policy structures and the logics of who conducts education. And the commercialization side would introduce more of the sales and marketing, education goods and services, often for commercial gain, into this kind of framework. To also mention the rise of the distance learning, the edtech technology industry can come out into this commercialization circle in this way. Looking at Sweden within this kind of frame, we see that there is indeed, let's put it as an amalgamation of privatization going on here, where the private education operators in that circle are fully publicly funded. They are not allowed to be selective. They are to be open for all, not to charge any fees, but at the same time, they are allowed to operate for profit. And this pushes the commercialization circle into the privatization one in a very interesting and, in fact, also internationally unique way. So let's dwell into some of the details, some of the characteristics that we see in this particular policy setup in Sweden. First of all, parents can select any school for their child, regardless of operator, free of charge. They are not allowed to be selective and no parental fees. Instead, these privately operated schools, they are fully publicly funded through taxes, through vouchers that are provided by municipalities. The private education providers still, as I said, are allowed to generate profits. And this is the unique part in it all. And this particular setup has, in fact, also boosted an expansion of private education providers. We will look at this expansion from visually from a few angles here, beginning with the share of students. The light blue line represents preschool, the dark blue one, compulsory school, and the orange one with a very steep increase represents upper secondary education. In Sweden, it's ages 16 to 19, and compulsory education is 6 to 15-year-old students. So there is an increase, evidently, but the increase is also geographically very unevenly distributed. So in urban areas, we can have 50% or more that are attending the privately operated preschools, when other municipalities, even though they are very few, may not have a private option within their geographical domain. There are 290 Swedish municipalities. But not only is the share of students increasing, but also the share of corporations. And you can see that in this in the orange one, the upper secondary, 88% is operated by corporations, and they are the forms that are allowed to operate for profit. Moving on to explore this expansion from another angle, we can follow the public funding. As I said, there is a public voucher distributed by municipalities, and this shows how much money municipalities have paid private providers in the area of education from 2002 to 2016. And we can observe, firstly, that the for-profits, the darker blue bars, are indeed outcompeting the non-profits. But we can also see that there is also, in this way of looking at it, a clear increase in the scale and scope of these activities. And finally, let's take a look at who are the actors in these dark blue bars. Well, they are also getting larger and larger, because another trend is consolidation, when the larger education companies are buying the smaller units, thereby enlarging their own market shares. They are also operating now in quite complex and not very transparent company structures always, increasingly complex and also displaying an extensive growth. This is already, I think, 3 or 4 years old. The largest circle to this end, Academedia, they have 82,000 students from preschool to adult education, not from the cradle to the grave, but almost 82,000 students enrolled. And the circle below displays the increase in the last 5 years, from 2015-ish. What this illustrates is that if we take this company as an example, the largest one, they represent themselves as the largest education company in Northern Europe, and they also, as a principal organizer, huvudman, is larger than the largest Swedish municipality, the city of Stockholm, with 1 million inhabitants. So they do expand also in their scale and scope, and they are not just marginal features in the Swedish system. So moving on, let's try now to pin some of the central points in the evolution of this Swedish emerging education industry. We remember the 1990s reforms. First, it was a very slow expansion, and the non-profits still had a role to play, a remarkably significant role to play. But in the mid-1990s, a very important decision that I often find is underplayed in the story of Swedish privatization. It is a very important decision, I think, taken by the Social Democratic government, meaning that free schools were to receive exactly the same amount of tax-funded financial support as the public schools, But in return, the free schools had to abolish school fees. And this was done in order to ensure that every family and every parent would have the same opportunity to choose, regardless of the size of their wallet, so to speak. This decision, however, really boosted corporate business involvement in education. It opened the door to larger profit potentials, and it is around after implementing this decision that we see how companies and chains are starting to take over and how they are even more expanded in the fourth point here, also attracting with their large profit margins both national and international venture capital and equity firms that also come into this. And now, as we saw on the previous slide, the larger chains are getting larger. They are either enlisted on the public stock exchange or they are delisting themselves to return to ensure some privacy of their operations. And we mentioned the ownership concentration as well as a central feature. Still, this development has not been without its political challenges and pressures. Indeed, as in other parts of Europe, there has been concerns about education inequalities and also in Sweden. And it's important to remember the steep PISA decline that Sweden experienced a decade ago that really pushed education and also privatization on the national agenda. However, it has been very hard, even though, for instance, the report from the OECD in 2015 really encouraged Sweden to change and revise its school choice policies. It has been very hard to alter and change the system that has been put into place. We can listen to Stefan Löfven that was quoted in the Times Educational Supplement a decade ago when he was still in opposition, not as prime minister, warning other countries to be cautious about allowing for-profit schools. Look what happened in Sweden. It has developed into a wild west and it's not a good system. And even though being in office for two consecutive periods, we still cannot see any significant changes that have been made in this regard. So let's try to sum up the Swedish policy story so far. First, we have a politically engineered quasi-market, and this has been evolving within the Swedish very comprehensive welfare state, and it has, due to its architecture and its setup, really presented some substantial business opportunities here. And this is a new situation. These companies are really seen as attractive investments. And following this, we see new actors coming in, financial interest, equity firms, and the international capital that are in fact investing in Swedish school companies. And in this way, and by their growth, they are really becoming an integrated part of not only the national economy, but also the school sector in itself, of course. The actors behind the creation and development, but also the operation of the Swedish school markets are closely interlinked. Sweden is a comparatively small country. And even though there have been discussions about the appropriateness of the system, we have labeled it as something that has been very hard to alter and change, where the Swedish government has governed by preservation and restoration rather than allowing for any substantial change. But given that, what can we say? Where are we going off to? What's next, given this? Well, there are some increasing signs that this, the more negative sides of the privatization of the school system that are increasingly being voiced by new sets of actors on the non-socialist side, not the least, in their party youth organization, in newspaper editorials, in party congresses, and so on. We also see responses from the welfare industry, of which the school companies are a part, of course, in which they proactively and forcefully engage and advocate and lobby any prospective market shifts. Of course, they're trying to prevent any significant policy change. And at the same time, these actors also need to diversify and extend their operations. And that's why one of the next exits that they are embarking into is also the global expansion. So now we're getting close to where we will head. also moving on from Sweden to the international domain. Quoting Fraser Nelson here a decade ago in the Daily Telegraph. So the Swedes have an education industry, but Britain, which has far better schools, does not. So if anyone sells British education to the Chinese, it will be the Swedes. Let's see if that is the case. Even though we will not move to China, we'll move to India. But before we do, we want to just set the scene very, very briefly to say that we see the global education industry as a very important external context here. And when moving across borders, international companies, they do bring something with them. They are carriers of their own culture, of certain ideas about teaching, about product development, etc., particular curricular approaches. But so far, the literature tends to have been focused on either Anglo-Saxon and they often go together, the very large global education businesses. And we see it as important to highlight also the presence of Swedish actors within this global education industry, because it can contribute to perspective from a smaller Western, but also the non-Anglo-Saxon national context. And this creates, as we will go into, a very particular dynamic. So, when transitioning from Sweden to establish abroad, the companies that we have followed in our research, they adopt various business models. They can either choose to go abroad to establish new schools from the ground up, as in the Indian case that we will soon hear more about, where they actually brought a Swedish blueprint also on how the premises, the architecture, how the premises should look like, and built new schools from the ground up, literally. But we have also examples of other companies with other models, either buying existing schools and rebranding them, or even to keep the original branding, but owning and operating them abroad. But at the same time, what these companies do have as a commonality is that they come from Sweden, and they have indeed, from the domestic policies, they have been nurtured by particular favorable financial and political environments that has indeed enabled their international growth. And now we have reached the point where Nafsika will take over and talk about the Indian case. Nafsika, please.
Thank you. So I will try to be quick, because I realize that we are close to the hour for our time. What we wanted to do with this sub-study of the Going Global project is to look at the tensions that we anticipated that we will find when those international private companies enter in a specific national and local context, in this case, the context of India. And we wanted to look at what kind of effect this has on teachers' work. So for this paper and for these very few minutes now, I will just talk about the impact on teachers and the possibility of teachers to shape their own practice. So next slide, please, Linda. This is just a quick flavor of the kinds of buildings that this company has built in the north part of the country. And if we go to the next slide. These were the research questions for our study. It was set up as a case study of professional practice and how that develops. And we looked at what we call them learning company schools, to try to keep some anonymity. And we tried to examine the kinds of discourses that the company is using around teaching, learning, the relationship between the two and the work of teachers. How teachers themselves and company managers, but also head teachers, define the purposes of education and the goals for these schools, and to what extent these changes expect teachers to adapt or to completely change their own practices and their own knowledge about practice, to what extent there is some space for professional agency. So we are using teacher agency as our conceptual lens. And I'm not going to go into this now. And this is our material in brief. So we had on-site visits to 3 schools in India by our co-researcher, Sophie Holm. And we had interviews with company representatives, both in India and in Sweden, principals of those schools in India, and also teachers from those sites, and also quite a lot of ethnographic types of notes from those visits. So next PowerPoint, please. Very quickly on the background, there was a very interesting report by UNESCO in 2022 and quite a lot of research from Indian researchers who view India as a very hospitable, kind of very favorable context for private international companies. 35% of all Indian children are registered in private for-profit schools. And there is an increasingly large middle class and significant social mobility that requires quite a lot of new and fresh ideas in the private education market. An old continuing desire to have education in English, and also distrust towards local schools and local pedagogies. So this makes for a very kind of hospitable context for international private companies. At the same time, in 2020, the Indian government published the National Education Policy 2020. That was the title of the document. And in that one, they very much criticized Indian traditional teaching approaches and teacher education as quite old-fashioned. So they very much used the standard kind of progressive language that we see in a lot of international documents around learning to learn as an objective, having holistic development of children, critical thinking development, and all of those kind of buzz keywords. In the schools that we looked at, all of the teachers are Indian, so there are no expats or Swedish or international teachers. They're all local teachers, and they have received their teacher education within India. And interestingly, the attraction to work in those Swedish private schools was not financial. They would get paid more in the state sector than working in those private schools. But the attractiveness for these teachers was the working conditions, both the working conditions, but also the professional development that they say has completely altered their approach towards teaching. So these were the two main themes that they were talking about as the reasons for changing from the state sector. Next PowerPoint, please. So I'm going to pick very, very selectively on very few things as findings. The first thing that we were quite surprised by is how uniform the language used was to describe what are the goals and the purposes of education in those schools. The same kind of words and the same sentences that we could read in the policy texts, the company texts, we had from the head teachers, from the managers, and from the entirety of the teaching body. So they all used a very uniform, very standardized kind of language. We did not find any attempt to use an alternative kind of language to describe what teachers intend to do or what they are trying to do. And also remarkable was the absence of any references to the Indian context, both in terms of cultural, historical, social context, but also the labor market. So there were no references to the Indian context. All of them were towards this international, globalized world of the future that the schools are preparing the students for. Next, please. The second thing that we would like to highlight here concerns the kind of themes that they used. Again, all of the groups, the teachers, the managers, and the head teachers. So they all articulated those pedagogic views around autonomy of learners, learning to learn, independent students, individualized learning, criticality of thought, etc. Two things stand out when it comes to the way that the teachers mainly, but also the other groups, referred to a new approach to knowledge, a complete adoption of the Swedish/Westernized kinds of objectives for education. And this was very much materialized in that school in a learning portal. And that was a digital learning portal that the school is using that provides teachers with very extensive, very rich resources for all of their teaching activities. So they don't have to design any materials. All of the materials are given to them. And this kind of portal was also discussed and presented to us as a guarantee of quality for parents as well. So it is independent on the quality of individual teachers. It is a standard high quality product that all parents can expect that their children will be exposed to. And that also meant, of course, that the teachers are released to have more time for individual support to students. So the one-to-one kind of help to students rather than creating materials. So this, we find it's a very, very strong kind of framing of the kind of knowledge and knowledge objectives that teachers are to work with. And they very much adopt that. They see that as a very positive kind of development for their own career. And the second one that we thought is quite interesting to highlight here is the number of cultural assumptions that are made about what the Indian teaching identity would entail, that the teachers have been asked to leave behind. So the teachers are seen as complete carriers of this new knowledge and of this new pedagogy and these new values, and they are expected to completely abandon their experiences of teaching in the past, their training that they had in the Indian teacher education institutions. At the same time, we need to say that the school recognizes this is a very fragile kind of process, and they have to work at that. They have to work on this identity of teachers as new teachers in this Swedish kind of school, so that they don't, and I'm using their words, they don't slip back into their old ways of practice that are not the desirable ones for this school. Next one, please. Another thing that we found was quite interesting is that the teachers very willingly adopt these roles that we see as very non-agentic, roles that very much restrict what they can do in terms of they have to implement predetermined lesson plans, predetermined designs for their teaching. And we find that this operation in that kind of environment that only looks towards this future and tries to completely reject the past of the teachers, constrains their possibilities for acting in a reflective kind of way in their practice. There are very few possibilities for them and very few needs for them to select any course of action that is not already offered by this digital learning platform. No need to look for different materials because they're all there. No need for doing different designs of teaching. They're all uploaded, and that's quite a rich resource. So one of the teachers had said, we have to unlearn a lot to learn this, and we thought this really captures what we find across both the material, the written material, but also the interviews of all the different groups of interviewees that we did, that the whole school is trying to help teachers unlearn their past teaching practice and experiences and to learn this new. And this, of course, entails a lot of implicit hierarchical ordering of what is desirable. So the Indian approaches to pedagogy and knowledge are rejected as old-fashioned, too traditional, and not what the school wants to do. So some final reflections. We find that these cultural assumptions about the superiority of the Swedish curriculum and the Swedish kind of pedagogical knowledge provided by this learning platform and this program contributes to this very strong framing of knowledge within the schools. We also find that the position of teachers as complete recipients of this kind of knowledge and expertise creates very limited possibilities for alternative viewpoints. Now, and here we need to have a little footnote to say that it could very well be that teachers are more critical, but they did not wish to convey that to us in their interviews. But at the same time, this is what the school creates and the school uses for marketing this very international cosmopolitan kind of identity for themselves and for the pupils. And this is something that the school uses as a marketing device at the same time. So I think I will stop here, and if people have an interest, I will refer you to the paper. Thank you.